Thanks.
Thank you. All right, so hello everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good night, because we have some speakers coming from or joining from the US. So that's my real pleasure to welcome you to the second session of the Asian Regulatory Conference. And the second session will be dedicated on post-approval changes. So I will be actually co-chairing this session with my colleague Andrew Devin. So personally, I'm global head of innovation, culture, and engagement within Sanofi Vaccines, within global quality, after I spent most of my career in regulatory affairs. I'm also leading or co-leading a couple of CMC and quality working groups at Vaccines Europe and IFPMA, including the joint Vaccines Europe IFPMA CMC working group on COVID. So my colleague Andrew Devin actually will moderate with me. Do you want Andrew to introduce yourself?
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you, Thierry. Yeah, welcome everybody. Great pleasure to be chairing this alongside Thierry for post-approval changes. My name is Andrew Devin. I work in GSK. I lead the policy for mainly Asian countries for GSK, but also very passionate and very much engaged in this topic of post-approval changes as well. So very pleased to be chairing it alongside here. I've been involved in various organizations and also with Thierry for a number of years, particularly on this topic. So great pleasure to be here alongside everybody else. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So can we have the first slide on the housekeeping information? Can you move to the next? Yeah. All right. So just a few things. Some of you may be already familiar with if you attended yesterday's session, but just for those who didn't join, you are all muted, and we encourage you to use the Q&A box to raise your questions to the speakers. And the speakers may answer your questions online. We'll have a few time slots for Q&As, but not a lot of time I have to say because we have a pretty busy agenda. The other thing is also to inform you that all these presentations will be available, of course, after the conference. As you can see here, there is a reference made to Mentimeter, but in fact, there will not be this type of tool used during this session. I think we can move to the next slide, please. Yeah, so post-approval changes, just to set the scene, is actually the reason why actually there is a session on post-approval changes. More specifically, is that because there is a global challenge with regards to the post-approval changes. And the global challenge is because not all countries in the world have the same legislative framework. They don't have the same regulatory requirements, not the same regulatory procedures, depending on the regions, but not also the same timelines and predictable timelines. Not also the same scientific and regulatory maturity, and this results in different outcomes when at the time of assessing and approval of the post-approval changes. And also there are different implementation timelines post-approval, what is so-called usually grace periods. So the result of all those differences and pretty high heterogeneity in the world results in a very complex situation for all medicines and vaccines, and particularly actually for biologicals and vaccines, which are more complex products to manufacture. And this is triggering risks of supply and shortages of those medicines and vaccines. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do today during this session is to explore ways to improve this global challenge. And we are going to actually divide this session into three parts. one which is about convergence and harmonization, another one on reliance, and another one on risk-based approaches. What I can say, and certainly those of you who attended yesterday's first session, is that it will resonate a lot with actually what has already been said yesterday by a number of speakers, but now more focused on post-approval changes. So let's see now at the agenda of the next slide, please. So the agenda will be divided, along these three parts: convergence, harmonization, reliance, and risk-based approaches. So you see a number of speakers for each session. Like I said, after each part that you can see on this agenda, we will have a short Q&A that will enable the speakers maybe to provide responses to eventual questions verbally or orally. We will have a break in the middle of the session, and we will have a panel discussion at the very end with a number of the speakers. So without further ado, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, and then introduce actually the part one of the session around convergence and harmonization. Our first speaker is Jesus Joyce Cirne, who will speak about the Philippines FDA perspective on the importance of convergence and harmonization in the context of the post-approval changes. Jesus is a director at the Center for Drug Regulation and Research at the Philippine FDA. So thank you for attending, and thank you, Jesus, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can I have the first slide, please? Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My presentation will cover three areas. I will talk about the regulatory convergence and harmonization, the Philippine FDA's participation in this regional endeavor for harmonization, and the FDA's efforts towards regulatory convergence. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, when we look at regulatory convergence and harmonization, there are different definitions available. You can Google this out. But one thing is certain. It allows regulatory authorities to have somehow, without starting from scratch, you rely on others' studies, you rely on what they have done, other national regulatory authorities that are regarded as reference drug regulatory authorities, or what we call stringent regulatory authorities. However, in order for this to be adopted, you have to have existing guidelines from within your country that allows adoption of what is already existing in the global scene for regulatory science. When you look at regulatory convergence, it's more like you align yourself to what is already accepted in order to facilitate access of medicines in the market without sacrificing safety, efficacy, and quality. But you have to have a mechanism from within your local legal context in order for such endeavor to be viable, to be implemented, and to be part of your regulatory processes within your NRA. Next slide, please. Okay, now in the context of ASEAN, as the Philippines is a member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nation, among the forefathers, even in the 60s, Philippines was among the ASEAN member states that signed the ASEAN framework. Now, in the early 1992, the ASEAN economic ministers look at how access of products within ASEAN will be facilitated by eliminating technical barriers to trade. Because originally, each ASEAN member state will have its own requirement for the transfer of goods from one country, from one border to another. Now, through the ASEAN economic ministers, they agreed to come up with a measure that will allow and realize free trade within ASEAN. So, following 1992, in the 13th meeting of the Association of Southeast Asia Nation Consultative Committee on Standards and Quality, which was held in Manila in 1999, the Pharmaceutical Product Working Group, because there are several working groups depending on the category, but for pharmaceutical product is called ACCSQ PPWG, started to develop a harmonized scheme that will allow the 10 member states. Originally, the one that signed in the 60s was not 10, but then a lot of other Southeast Asian nations joined. So in the latter part, there were already 10 member states. Now there are 10 member states plus, 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 with an objective again of having a free trade, removing technical barriers to trade of goods and services without compromising safety, efficacy, and quality. Then look at how pharmaceutical products will enter this scene of easy access, removing technical barrier to trade. So they established in the series of meetings the ASEAN Common Technical Documents, ASEAN Common Technical Requirements, including ASEAN variation guidelines for pharmaceutical products. So the ASEAN, the ACCSQPPWG is already in the right track in making sure that there is access. However, again, not compromising safety, efficacy, and quality. Now, the Philippine FDA being party to the ASEAN member states, ACCSQ PPWG, internally we started as well issuing appropriate legal basis for us to be able to adapt whatever it is that that has been agreed at the level of ASEAN. Next slide, please. So there are different efforts coming in, and there are also different available documents already in the either WHO or other stringent regulatory authorities. So for the Philippines, we look at the WHO TRS. We also look at other available documentations that we can rely on, like that of the ICH, and as well as EMA and other regulatory convergence that we can make use of, because we want products to be easily accessible, again, without compromising safety, efficacy, and quality. Next slide, please. So how did we do it? So during the pandemic, we had the emergency use authorization. We don't have this in our law. Republic Act 9711, Republic Act 3720, we don't have this. So we had to ask the Philippine president, then former President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, through an executive order. But in it already was reliance. There was, for the issuance of the EUA, we use reliance because these are already available in countries that the Philippines has regarded as a stringent regulatory authority to accelerate availability of these products in the market. Availability of these products through EUA, but not as freely sold, but through vaccination sites, because the Philippines issues a certificate of product registration if it's for market authorization, market availability. For the EUA, it's a special authorization, but will not put the product available as a market authorization. At the end, we also use because there are so many changes during the lifespan of an EUA of a given COVID-19 vaccine. There's so many variations that are happening. So we also use reliance in our evaluation of these changes during the lifespan of the emergency use authorization. Next slide, please. We also issued the drugs for emergency use. Again, reliance was also part of the picture. These are products which are already available in the Philippine market, but used for other indications. However, during the how science evolved in the treatment of COVID vaccine, some of the products were already used in the management of COVID-19 patients. So the Philippines issued a legal basis from wherein we can repurpose products that we call drugs for emergency use, just to make sure that this will be made available to the patients that are already in critical condition for like cytokine invasion and others. Next slide, please. Okay, then that's for COVID-19 endeavors. Now we go to the regular marketing authorization applications. So we have the facilitated registration pathways. Now, for the abridged and verification review, there has to be a regulatory assessment from a reference drug regulatory authority for it to be processed under facilitated review pathway. If it's only one stringent regulatory authority or RDRA, then it will be through abridged. But if there are two already, then it will be through verification review. The order that we use in this particular endeavor is signed by the secretary, and the implementing rules signed by the Director General of the Philippine Food and Drug Administration. We cannot use any legal basis if it is not signed by appropriate authorities of the Philippine government. Next slide, please. Then this is how we do with the registration pathways for abridged, limited independent review, and for verification. We will just validate. However, the product that is available from country of reference should be totally the same, and the documents unredacted, because we use reliance in the approval or issuance of a marketing authorization. Any change will disqualify the application for facilitated review pathways, either a bridge or verification review. Next slide, please. So we have also another one, the collaborative review procedure. Now, the Philippines is a signatory to the WHO endeavor. So we have another issuance, the CRP we call. Now, the review of applications for initial registration of the World Health Organization pre-qualified pharmaceutical products, including vaccines. So the applicant will have to inform us if the applicant has products already inside before the issuance of these legal basis. They have to inform us. Same thing with the facilitated review pathway, but they have to sufficiently comply with our requirements in order for them to be facilitated. Otherwise, they will follow the regular evaluation process. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we are looking at the different ways to make products easily available without compromising safety, efficacy, and quality. We have already the reliance both for facilitated review process and the CRP procedure. We do have also with the ASEAN the joint assessment with other member states. Next slide, please. Now for the review processes, this for us this would lead to lower cost. Second, because it will be the applicant will they don't have to generate so many documents. They can generate one document, ACTD, and then follow the ACTR requirements. It also facilitates for us communication between national regulatory authorities. We can ask them, since FDA Philippines is a national regulatory authority, communication will not be that difficult. Export to other countries will not also be that difficult already. So facilitation will be the name of the game. Next slide, please. So this is my presentation, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Jesus, for your presentation. Without further ado, I will leave the floor to Larry Lee. So Larry is calling from the US, meaning that it's the middle of the night for him today. Larry is Deputy Director of Science at the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality at CDER at the US FDA. And Larry is also a member of the ICMRA Post-Approval Changes Working Group representing the US FDA. And Larry is actually going to explain to us what the current pilot, which has launched by ICMRA in post-approval changes, is about. So thank you, Larry, for joining.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Hello, everyone. Today, I am going to give you a quick overview of ICMRA pilot, specifically with focus on post-approval changes collaborative assessment. Next slide, please. And after my today's presentation, if you want to know more about the ICMRA pilots, including both post-approval change collaborative assessment, as well as hybrid inspection, I encourage you to visit our ICMRA website on this topic using the 2D barcode shown here. And next slide, please. So let me just point out the collaborative pilots come out of the ICMRA workshop on enabling manufacturing capacity that was held in July 2021. It was an opportunity for an exchange of views between regulators and the pharmaceutical industry on the regulatory feasibility introduced to enhance the manufacturing capacity of COVID-19 products. The workshop intended to serve as a catalyst for regulators looking to change, developing a more efficient and more effective regulatory approach to CMC changes, with the vision to work and advance together and with industry in strategic partnerships. Next slide, please. The overall vision of this ICMRA effort is to advance international partnership in a strategic way to facilitate faster access and continuous supply of high-quality medicine from a global perspective. The 2021 ICMRA workshop highlighted the need for more international convergence in order to overcome logistical challenges related to CMC assessment and inspection that we have experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially when we needed to increase the manufacturing capacity through post-approval changes to meet the global drug supply. And next slide, please. And with this goal in mind, we have developed a framework and sub-working groups for 2 pilots under the umbrella of ICMRA Pharmaceutical Quality Knowledge Management System Working Group, the so-called PQKMS working group. The two pilots focus on collaborative assessment of CMC-related post-approval changes, as well as hybrid inspection to support the approval of regulatory submissions. We have officially launched these two pilots in the last week of June this year to call for proposal from industry on the ICMRA website I showed previously. Briefly, each pilot will involve at least 2 regulatory authorities that will conduct 3 each of collaborative assessment and hybrid inspections. Both pilots are expected to last for about a year. At the end of the pilot, we will publish a report summarizing the key outcomes and lessons learned, including any misalignments, differences, and potential areas for alignment or harmonization across different regions, as well as experience of having multiple regulatory authorities to assess the same CMC information submitted by the drug manufacturer. And next slide, please. My presentation today focuses on one of the ICMRA pilots programs, which is collaborative assessment of CMC post-approval changes. Next slide, please. The goal of this pilot is to advance international partnerships, as I mentioned before, in a strategic manner to facilitate faster access and continuous supply of high-quality medicines from a global perspective through a more coordinated and streamlined regulatory assessment of post-approval changes at the global level. And under this pilot, it is expected that quality assessors from different regulatory authorities will work towards a common approach to the application assessment and decision-making, deliver a single list of questions or comments to the applicant whenever is possible, identify any differences for future conversions across different regions, share what we have learned from the pilot, and use it to develop best practices in the quality assessment of CMC post-approval changes. And next slide, please. The regulatory submissions being considered here should include considerations listed in this slide. For example, this pilot focuses on CMC post-approval changes, especially post-approval change management protocols. This pilot considers products that are intended for the treatment of patients with COVID-19, breakthrough or prime products, or medically necessary products, but not products that are distributed under an emergency use mechanism and not a marketing application. Another key points that I would like to emphasize here is that the submission should ideally involve an area where there is an opportunity for regulatory convergence or harmonization. And I also want to emphasize that even though this is a collaborative assessment, we don't expect to have any delay in terms of our making our regulatory decision and the approval of these type of changes. And next slide, please. We believe that to ensure the success of the program, it is very important to establish a strong partnership with industry to align with and have common understanding of the vision and the goal of this pilot. Specifically, industry needs to understand the realistic expectation of this pilot. We also need industry's help to understand the potential challenges associated with the pilot from the industry perspectives, as well as to identify candidate cases suitable for this pilot. Since January 2022, we have met with industry representatives a few times to share our plans for both collaborative assessment and hybrid inspection pilots in order to clarify our expectation of the pilots and to get feedback and buy-in from the industry. And then those meetings were very helpful and very successful. And next slide, please. It is important to emphasize the realistic expectation of this pilot. While we identify the opportunity for convergence in the future, harmonization and the desired convergence cannot be achieved only through a few pilot cases. Each regulatory authority is bound to their regional requirements or legal framework, and therefore differences related to this constraint cannot simply address through this pilot. Nevertheless, our working group is committed to drive towards achieving a single outcome, like for example, a common set of questions or comments to the sponsor for each application. Next slide, please. And since the launch of the ICMRA pilots in June 2022, we have received 6 proposals for collaborative assessment and 1 proposal so far for hybrid inspection. And I want to emphasize that this hybrid inspection is used to support the approval of the regulatory submission. It's not a surveillance inspection. We expect to accept 3 proposals for each pilot. For collaborative assessment, we already accepted 2 proposals. Both pilots remain open, and we encourage industry to continue to submit new proposals. Next slide, please. Let me share some details about the 2 accepted collaborative assessment proposal. The first proposal is a PACMP, the Post-Approval Change Management Protocol, for addition of new drug product manufacturing and testing sites for a biological molecule. The complexity of this proposal is that the assessment of PACMP or this PACMP will involve potentially up to 6 regulatory authorities. And the second proposal only involves 2 regulatory authorities. However, the challenges associated with this proposal is that the PACMP will include site transfer for both biological drug substance and drug products. And next slide, please. And let me also explain why other 4 remaining proposals were not considered for this pilot at this time. First, I really want to emphasize that all proposals are good proposals. The main reason for not accepting these proposals is because of limited resources, and we really have to limit to 3 proposals for this pilot at this point. There are also other secondary reasons. The PACMP in 1 proposal has been approved by one of the participating regulatory authorities, because in this pilot, we are really more interested in the parallel assessment rather than reliance practice. In other proposals, both FDA, US FDA and EMA were not included. And the post-approval changes in some proposals appears to be minor and may not fully benefit to furthering harmonization in the context of this pilot. And next slide, please. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation by acknowledging our working group members listed here, as they really work hard together to get to this point. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Larry, for this very interesting presentation. I'd like also to thank you for the transparency of the information that you have shared with us, in particular with actually which are those case studies that have been selected by ICMRA. I think we should acknowledge this level of transparency. This is very well appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so just as a reminder to all participants, feel free to ask questions to the speakers into the Q&A box. So far, we didn't receive a lot of Q&A questions, so feel free to ask more as you want. So the next presentation will be from Diane Wilkinson. It's about actually regulatory convergence and harmonization. And how this supported the delivery of COVID products and vaccines to patients. So Diane is Executive Director at the Global CMC Regulatory Affairs at AstraZeneca. Diane is also a member of the Vaccines Europe IFPMA COVID CMC team, and she is the team representative at the CEPI COVID manufacturing SWAT. So welcome, Diane, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thierry, and I hope you can all hear me okay. And thank you for inviting me to join this presentation. It's really important that we work towards improving how we can respond to challenges such as we currently have lived through. The diagrams on my introduction slide really show the unprecedented challenge we had from a virus, which infected many billions of people globally. But from a regulatory context, we're working in a very diverse world. So next slide, please. So how did we work with people to do that? Before I go into some examples, I wanted to mention some of the groundwork really which had been laid and which really resulted in some success for acceptance of scientific risk-based approaches and some of the regulatory flexibilities that we were able to successfully apply, not just at AZ, but I know in some of our other companies as well, which were producing vaccines. So I've listed there a couple of examples. I'm not going to go through those in any detail, but well worth a read if people are wanting to understand a little bit more background into the types of approaches that were tried and were successful and where there were still areas for improvement. Next slide, please. So to win the race, lots of approaches were tried. From a manufacturing perspective, we were trying to use new technologies. We were using new partners and experts in the field and new suppliers. From the regulatory side as well, very much a partnership with them, looking at new ways of working to improve things such as the Open Initiative in Europe. AZ was certainly part of that and had a number of other agencies observing how that review progressed. A number of new ways of collaboration. So we had that early and ongoing dialogue that was so important with certainly with our stringent reg authority, the EMA, and with some other agencies as well. Very open dialogue was there, but also new mechanisms as well. The COVAX facility that was set up to ensure that product could get to all areas around the world. And very importantly, as I mentioned, it was about applying some of those regulatory flexibilities that weren't new, but hadn't really been applied particularly widely, and looking for the application of accelerated science risk-based approach rather than tick box type, we need 12 months data for this. It was actually looking at the science and the data that was available to support the way forward. And the result of all of that was that AZ was able to get that first supply of vaccines onto the market in record time within the 10-month time frame. Next slide, please. And that also meant that we had some success in our post-approval world as well. Of course, any accelerated program will mean that there are many, many post-approval measures and post-approval commitments that are made to agencies. Part of what we did, though, to try and think about that and plan up front for changes that we knew would happen, we knew there would need to be extension of manufacturing sites and the supply chain. as we were trying to meet the needs of 3 billion people to receive vaccines. And we did that through the use of post-approval change management protocols, PACMPs. I think we included 6, up to 6, depending on the MAA, in our original submissions. And certainly many of those, even under emergency use, they were widely accepted by key agencies, including Europe. And we're very grateful to the agencies for engaging with us on that, which allowed us to have that sustainability of supply of vaccine for patients. It was, of course, not overall universally accepted. There were some countries who said, you know, the PACMPs are not part of their legislation, and therefore we had to go through more formal post-approval mechanisms, which, you know, often would put supply under threat. So that is certainly an area where for the next time and for the future, we need to look at more widely approving tools like PACMPs, which I know there's going to be a presentation on that afterwards, as it is a regulatory tool which is there and which is encouraged through ICH Q12. Next slides, please. Another area was testing, where we were having to add sites for testing for drug substance and for the final vaccine drug product. We were using sites that were already registered with our stringent regulatory agencies, and we hoped that there would be acceptance by, therefore, the international community. And in many, many cases, that was the case, that they accepted that review from the SRA and allowed those to move forward, using them within our product quality system. That said, there is still room for improvement with some markets who would not participate in that review. And again, with it being the same data, same product, you know, I think we have to question that where in cases like COVID, where patients were waiting, that we actually apply that sort of scientific pragmatism and look to actually overcome any of the hurdles that may seemingly be in the way of progress. And certainly for in-country testing, we were seeing often 3 sets of same data for the same batch of vaccine having to be performed, in our eyes, using doses which could have been delivered to patients and was delaying time for those batches to be approved in markets. So certainly an area for consideration of potential convergence. Next slide, please. Another area which can often be a sort of last minute completion is the process validation area. As people are aware, you know, we normally have to have all that data up front, but for this, there wasn't the time to do that. And I think, again, on a science, risk-based, benefit-based perspective, many agencies were prepared to accept protocols for this area. So we had batches that were made pre-PPQ, and we had prior agreement with certain agencies that, providing we were using the same site, same equipment, scale and testing, that we could potentially use those batches and commercialize them, providing the data proved to be acceptable post-approval. And indeed, that proved to be the case, that we were on approval, the data was satisfactory. So our pre-PPQ batches were allowed to be commercialized, which again is a very novel concept for vaccines, but it allowed all those batches that would have otherwise been destroyed to get into the arms of patients and save many, many lives. Next slide, please. Process validation, as I mentioned, so we were not able to complete that ahead of submission. Otherwise, that would have meant a significant delay in getting vaccines to patients. We submitted protocols and any data that we had to support the process validation and the work that was being performed. So we often had partial data sets for particular sites. And made those post-approval commitments to provide full data as we progressed with manufacture. That supported as well from across sites. So we used that prior knowledge and that platform data, and that was widely accepted by a number of agencies. And we really hope that that pragmatic application of that science risk-based approach can be adopted in the future, as we now have much more confidence and understanding of the products that we use around the world. Next slide, please. Another area which often we're waiting for data to be able to move forward, of course, is stability and then the determined shelf life. So again, very novel for a biologic and vaccine perspective. We requested 6 months data at the time of approval based off the limited data that we had at the time, which was 3 months. We did still receive some requests from markets, from certain agencies for real-time data, which is the normal requirement to support shelf life. But we had to be very explaining to them that if they waited for that data, they would have to wait for vaccine and delay access to products to save lives in their country. Normally in those discussions, we were able to gain acceptance of that. And indeed, you know, the risk was worth taking. The data that was subsequently generated supported the shelf life that we have. We were also able to use that early development data and data that we had from other sites to support that shelf life proposal in other markets. And again, those proposals were widely accepted, showing that that science risk-based approach for stability extrapolation of biologics and vaccines was something which was a risk worth considering for the benefit of patients and saving patients' lives. And we hope that that can be applied again in a wider context in the future in both the MAA and post-approval space. Next slide, please. In terms of comparability, of course, we were expanding the supply chain, so needed to use many comparability assessments using 3 elements for our drug substance, as listed here with release, characterization, stability data, and 2 elements for drug product in release and characterization. And really trying to apply the thinking that this is about sameness of product, not process, but actually what was of significant critical areas for patients and their safety and efficacy of product. And again, we saw that widely accepted by many agencies. Stability, as always, generally the time limiting factor. And again, we were able to make those post-approval commitments in that post-approval space to be able to provide any conceived gaps in data, real-time data that were not available at the time of submission post-approval, either in the MA or the emergency use procedure. And again, we use that prior knowledge and platform data to support that. And again, that was widely accepted by many agencies. Next slide, please. In terms of regulatory flexibilities, I've already mentioned these are PACMPs. In terms of reliance, it was astounding, to see the success of applying reliance through the WHO emergency use procedure. So we had more than 87 countries participated in that. Once we gained approval from the stringent reg authority, which was the EMA in our case, the WHO approved within a couple of days, and then those 87 countries, again, off the back of that WHO reliance MAA, and also into the post-approval space as well. That said, there's room for improvement. So we did have over 100 other national competent authorities, for whatever reason, did not join that WHO emergency use procedure, and therefore quite often saw delays in access to vaccine products for patients in their country. And again, I think that's something that as we move forward as a globe, we are the people in these meetings that can actually improve that for the future and make those changes that are needed to make sure that products which are the same, we're applying the same science and generate the same data, can be applied in that more global context through reliance and convergence. In terms of HAQs, health authority questions, we did often see that some agencies would ask many, many questions on a supply chain which had already been reviewed and approved by another agency. And those questions, unfortunately, were academic exercises. They did not result in any changes to process, controls, control strategies, specifications, analytical methods. And again, from a company perspective, it was frustrating that we knew we had a product that was safe, efficacious, and acceptable quality, but we were delayed in getting that product to patients in some of those countries. And that month or so delay was a month of people, unfortunately, maybe dying from COVID. And that's something we really need to keep in mind here, is the impact of any what seemed to be a minor delay on patients. We had the unique experience of donations, where we were having donations to countries from different supply chains, and that was all happening at very short notice, often at weeks. And we'd like to thank some of the agencies which supported us in that, in again providing data and confidence through discussion to those receiving agencies and countries that the batches that were available for donation were acceptable. So particular mention in the Asia region, for example, to the TGA for support there for some of those donations, resulting in approvals and acceptance of those donations within a few days. And we did witness some of the collaborative assessments that are being promoted through ICMA now, and we applaud those ICMA initiatives in trying to build these collaborative assessments and move that thinking forward in that post-approval space, because it's, as we said, it's the same product, the same science with the same data, and hopefully therefore the same acceptance and review outcomes. Next slide, please. So to finish on some recommendations, great to see some further collaboration with areas of agencies such as the ICMA and ongoing dialogue such as we're having today. For viral variants and new viruses, we'd like to see use of more reliance on platform data and prior knowledge. And we recommend maybe abridged developments rather than full development for some of those progressed areas. Promoting harmonized science risk-based approaches. We really ask agencies be open to the thinking of it's the science which should drive the data, not maybe applying some guidance which might be 30 years out in the area where technology and scientific thinking has moved on, and that we really try to use those science risk-based approaches for the benefit of patients. So that really is the recommendations for more efficient use for both companies and agencies to importantly expedite patient access to medicines. And I'll finish on the final slide, which really provides more background information in a couple of papers published by Vaccines Europe and other groups, which talk to some of the proposals made in the situation and the detailed technical reflections coming out of those. And last slide. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diane, for this very interesting presentation. And now we're moving to the next and last one for this part one of the session, which is more focused on the PA-CMP experience. So this presentation will be made by Connie Langer, who is also calling from the middle of the night, as she's based in the US. Connie is director in the Global Regulatory Affairs CMC group at Pfizer. And Connie has been very involved with the ICH Q12 and also ICH M4Q at ISPE pharma organizations in particular. So the floor is yours, Connie.
Okay, thank you, Terry, and thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me to speak here today. It's really a pleasure to be here. So a post-approval change management protocol, or PACMP, is a comprehensively and prospectively written plan that describes proposed changes and also the studies and test methods and acceptance criteria to assess the impact of that proposed change. So it serves as an agreement then between the regulator and the applicant to allow a more predictable implementation of the change. And the tool has been available for nearly 20 years in the US, as well as 12 years in Europe, but it's not yet implemented globally. So we're really excited about the impact of ICH Q12 and then that tool being rolled out across many different countries. So the Q12 guideline defines this PACMP as a regulatory tool that provides predictability regarding the information required to support a CMC change and the type of regulatory submission based on prior agreement between the market authorization holder and the regulatory authority. Such a mechanism enables planning and implementation of future changes to establish conditions in an efficient and predictable manner. So this means that instead of doing everything at once, we get to split the review of the strategy from the review of the data. So a PACMP can be submitted with the original new drug application or as a post-approval submission. It can be used for multiple times for related changes, or even for similar changes across multiple products. And you don't have to use an enhanced development approach to use a PACMP. It's really just about giving the agency and the company a chance to agree up front how a change might be supported and then move forward under that agreement. So next slide. So what is new with using this PACMP approach compared to a traditional approach? In the traditional approach, it's really one step, and that requires the regulatory reporting. The manufacturer would submit a single package that contains all of the supporting data and required for that change. So that means that you need to wait until all the results are in before you can make the submission. Also, there's no prior agreement up front on the data package to support the change. So the standard reporting category and data package in the variation guidelines would be used. One advantage to using this traditional approach would be if your change needs supportive safety and efficacy data, then you can use this mechanism. For the PACMP approach, it's 2 steps. So the submission strategy is decoupled from the results. That means that the manufacturer can present the strategy to the regulator and negotiate and gain upfront agreement on what data might be needed. Like Diane was just mentioning, sometimes we have to wait for stability data. So if we can have an agreement around that upfront, that can help us with time efficiency. And also agreement upfront on the reporting category for the change. And then once the data is available, the actual variation package could be submitted. And the PACMP is that the implementing submission where the data is reviewed may be downrated by 1 or 2 reporting categories. And usually this would be from prior approval to a notification. And the results, this can result in the ability of the manufacturer to more quickly implement the change. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this PACMP is a 2-step process. In step 1, you would have submission of the written protocol that describes the proposed change, includes rationale, risk management activities, proposed studies, and acceptance criteria to assess the impact of the change, and other conditions to be met. The proposed reporting category for the change and any other supportive information. So the PACMP document can be located in Module 3.2 Regional, and it would be reviewed and approved by the regulatory authority before the execution of the protocol. The PACMP may be provided either in the original application or as a prior approval variation after the original application is approved. So then in step 2, you have your tests and studies that were outlined in the protocol, and you would perform those. And if those results met the acceptance criteria that was outlined in the protocol and any other conditions, then the market authorization holder can submit the information to the regulatory authority according to the category in the approved protocol. And that would then be reviewed by the regulatory authority as appropriate. And depending on the reporting category, approval by the regulatory authority may or may not be required prior to implementation of the change. And it's important to note that if the acceptance criteria or other conditions that were listed in the protocol were not met, then the change couldn't be implemented using that PACMP that was approved. So you need to meet whatever you outlined there. So next slide, please. And then within PACMP, there's 2 types. You could have a PACMP that is for a single product, and that could be used for 1 or more change associated with that single product. And if the protocol describes several changes for a particular product, then you'd need to include a justification to show that how those changes are related and that inclusion in a single protocol is appropriate. The PACMP could be used repeatedly to make the same type of change over the life cycle of the product, applying those same principles. And then you could use it for multiple products. This could be one change to be implemented across multiple products or across multiple sites. And the same risk mitigation strategy needs to be applied for all of the impacted products. So I'm going to share some examples with you from both of these categories, single and multiple product applications. And then next slide, please. And this one is a building slide, so I'll say next as each one. So the content and level of the details in a PACMP is dependent on the type of change, but would typically include the following elements in this puzzle. Next, please. So first you have a detailed description of the proposed change, including the rationale, and the differences before and after the proposed change should be clearly highlighted. Next. Risk assessment. So this is based on the initial risk assessment, a list of specific tests and studies to be performed to evaluate the potential impact of the proposed change. Typically, more complex changes would require enhanced product and process understanding. Next, you have your control strategy, and that would include a discussion regarding the suitability of the approved control strategy or any changes needed to control strategy associated with the planned change. Next. Then any other conditions that need to be met, such as confirmation that certain process qualification steps will be completed before implementation. Next, supportive data from previous experience with the same or similar products related to the development, manufacturing, characterization, batch release, and stability to allow risk mitigation. Next would be the reporting category, especially if you are requesting any kind of downgrading in reporting category. And then finally, next, the verification or confirmation that the ongoing verification will be performed under the PQS to continue to evaluate and ensure that there's no adverse effect on product quality. So Pfizer has gained a lot of experience with post-approval change management protocols in the regions where the mechanism has been available for years, and really look forward to more global applicability that will be made possible through the implementation of Q12. And in the interest of time, I've selected 3 examples. One is an equipment change, one's an analytical protocol in support of model maintenance, and then one multi-product packaging change. So next slide, please. Okay, so in this slide, we have the encapsulation change that I was mentioning. And this one was for a breakthrough therapy. And it was under regulatory review for registration when it was noted that the encapsulator that we were using, the configuration that it was set up impacted the dissolution performance of the capsules that were being manufactured. So it was desired to change to an alternate encapsulator as soon after approval as possible. So under breakthrough therapy, the development is moving really fast. So all of the clinical supplies, primary registration batches, validation batches, and launch supplies were manufactured using a Bosch encapsulator. And then additional development data showed that switching to a Harrow Hoflinger encapsulator mitigated the dissolution performance issues. So a PACMP was included in the initial EU MAA describing the plans to change encapsulators. So normally a change within the same equipment class and subclass would be a type 1B submission, but because we had the issues with the dissolution, that became a critical equipment change, so it would be a type 2 variation under normal submission. So the protocol that was included had a justification to downgrade the reporting category to a type 1B, and following approval of the PACMP, the experiments were conducted and the physical and chemical properties of the capsules manufactured with both encapsulators were found comparable. And the type 1B variation was submitted within 3 months of stability data and a commitment for 1 batch placed on long-term stability. And this really allowed implementation of the change 1 month after submission instead of 6 months. And that rapid implementation of the new encapsulator allowed for a more robust process to deliver this quality medicine for an important breakthrough therapy. So next slide, please. The second case study, this one is the multi-product PACMP. And in this example, we had a corporate driver to transition from one bottle resin across more than 50 products in the solid oral portfolio, sorry. And the risk assessment recognized that in a given product, the level of moisture and oxygen can impact degradation, and they're controlled by the permeability of the bottle. So to assess and submit each of those products, like I said, over 50, would be very time and resource intensive. So a PACMP was included, and it had a risk bracketing approach to assess the new bottle for just one of the products that was selected as a lead product based on a risk assessment. So one of the high risk products was evaluated. And 3 months of long-term stability data and accelerated stability data were generated on that lead product. And then in addition, the MVTR data for the bottle was demonstrating the compliance of the proposed bottle, and the data generated and the post-approval stability protocol and commitment for the proposed bottles was included in the PACMP. The stability commitment required the first production batch and annual batches thereafter to be placed on long-term stability. And then submission of the supportive stability data for the lead product using a CBE30 pathway enabled establishment of the new bottle with the FDA. And then the remaining 50 products, or more than 50 products in the portfolio, were able to implement the change via an annual reportable route. And the PACMP allowed immediate implementation of the bottle resin change across that broad portfolio of products once the new bottle was established with the agency. And next slide, please. And then the final example, we had a near IR method with a soft sensor that was used to monitor real-time blend potency during continuous manufacture. And the method was really just one element of an integrated control strategy, and it was not used as a release test. So therefore, this near IR procedure that used the partial least squares model was considered medium impact. So the data-driven multivariate model requires a rich data set and development effort to maintain robustness during the life cycle of the product, and therefore frequent changes were anticipated to maintain the model. The PACMP was included in the initial application and had validation criteria to ensure the method remains suitable for intended use, and proposed that the model updates could be done using annual reportable mechanism. And per the FDA guideline, this model update with new calibration set should be reported as CBE30, and per EU, similar update would be type 1B variation. So the plan for reporting changes to the model were approved in the US and Europe, and it allowed immediate implementation of the change instead of 1 month after submission. And then the next step for this is to gain approval in additional markets that don't currently allow PACMP or other Q12 tools. Next slide, please. So this slide just really summarizes the changes and what savings in time that we would be allocated using the PACMP mechanism. So you can see across the different the equipment, multi-product packaging change and model maintenance, it could be from a savings of up to 6 months. Now, just to mention also that even though we may get this approval up front, before we would implement a change that would require a CBE30 or type 1B variation, then we would need to go through a quality management review to sign off to implement that within 1 month period. And then next slide, this one is really just to wrap up. The use of the PACMP unlocks the potential to significantly reduce implementation time. And it also increases transparency and predictability of the changes. So it gives an opportunity for the agencies to have more awareness of upcoming changes. Also, opportunity for the applicant and the agencies to agree the strategy for the change upfront. An opportunity for the applicant and the agency to agree on the data required to support the change, and an opportunity for the applicant and the agency to agree on conditions to be fulfilled and implementation plan, and to increase the efficiency by reducing the chance of wasted work. So PACMPs are a really useful additional tool for lifecycle management, and they can be submitted, like I said before, with the new application or as a post-approval submission. They can be used for multiple products or a single product for multiple changes, multiple times across the lifecycle. And they're currently accepted in US, Europe, Switzerland, Japan, Canada, and Brazil. And now with the inclusion in Q12, they have the potential to really increase the efficiency for this, for global products. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for their attention. And if you do have any questions, I have my email here. Feel free to reach out to me. But thank you again for inviting me, Thierry.
Thank you very much, Connie, and very interesting presentation as well, and in particular, very interesting case studies. This is very practical, actually, experiences. Thank you very much. So thank you all for your questions in the Q&A box. Some of the questions have been answered online already. Unfortunately, we don't have time. We're running a little bit behind schedule. I mean, to take or to discuss about questions, or maybe just one. Maybe Andrew, do you want to take just one question?
Yeah, we can have one question. Yeah, there's been some good questions answered in the Q&A, by the way. I mean, I think the one around the convergence, future convergence of guidance, Mary Valentin from WHO has added a nice answer there. And there's also some good questions around unredacted assessment reports, and Diane has confirmed that yes, they did supply the same submission, but they also supplied the Q&A, and they even received the same Q&As from some countries. So some good ones there. There's quite a few coming through now, actually. I think we'll have to address some of those later. There's a sameness one which we can address in the next session. I'm just looking at one that might be quite good to answer now.
A quick one.
And yeah, we're probably running out of time, I suspect.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps we should move on, actually, because there's some really good questions there, but there's not one coming up definitely as a definite like.
So we don't have time, actually. So let's actually, we will answer after the conference then. But actually, they are all very good questions. By the way, I'll leave you the floor, Andrew, for moderating the next part.
Yeah. Thank you, Thierry. Yeah, and apologies to that because we're running short of time, but some really excellent questions. Yeah, now we're going to shift a bit of track. We're going to move now to Reliance. So Reliance has come up quite a few times. It came up a lot yesterday. It's coming up again today, and indeed some of the questions reflect that. One of the key things around Reliance, though, is a lot of it has been used up to now, really, for new registrations. But we're now starting to shift and seeing a shift into post-approval changes, and that's really important. And so I'm really, with great pleasure, want to introduce two speakers on this topic who are doing their part to really help lead the way in driving this this use of Reliance to post-approval changes. First up is Mary Valentin from WHO. Who is in the Regulatory Convergence Networks team and the Regulation Safety Unit, and she's going to give us a presentation on good reliance practices for post-approval changes. And then we've got Lynn Lepalliere from Sanofi, who's going to look at this excellent post-approval regulatory reliance pilot that Sanofi is undertaking. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll invite Mary Valentin to take the floor. Mary.
Thanks a lot, Andrew, and good day to you all. Thank you for the organizer to invite us to participate in this very interesting discussion. I think we've heard already some great example of pilot, and also we can see that things are moving forward. So we are very excited about all this work. My name is Mary Valentin, and as Andrew said, I work in the team Regulatory Conventions and Network at WHO headquarters in Geneva. So when the good reliance practice was developed, it was very important to highlight that reliance has a great potential in managing post-authorization changes. So we should look at the whole life cycle of medical products. Next slide, please. So this is just our outline. We'll discuss the good reliance practice and we'll see how it is implemented for post-authorization changes. Next slide, please. So first of all, why do we do reliance? And maybe many of you have seen these slides already, but when we look at the maturity level, so you know, as part of the regulatory system strengthening activity from WHO, we use the global benchmarking tool, which is a tool with 250 indicators to assess the level of maturity of the different regulatory system across the world. And when we look at the global picture, out of the 194 member states, we can see that 70%, so 146 countries, are still at maturity level 1 or 2. So it's not the stable maturity level 3 that we are trying to reach. So many countries are still have to still build capacity in terms of controlling the medical products that enter their country. So it's very important. We see that the picture is getting better, but there's still a lot of work in terms of building capacity of the regulatory system. So that's why the regulatory system strengthening activities at WHO are built on 2 work streams. One is to build the regulatory capacity in the member states according to the good regulatory practice, but also to, in number 2, to try to help regulatory authorities to work together, to cooperate, to collaborate, and to use reliance. Because for those countries where we need to build capacity, before we wait for all the regulatory authorities to be at a level of 3, we need to ensure that we can facilitate access of quality medical products. And reliance is a great tool for that in terms of facilitating the access to quality products. Next slide, please. So reliance really is a tool to try to have a more efficient use of global resources. And one could ask, are we using the global regulatory resources as best as we can? And actually the answer is maybe there is a margin for improvements. When we look at all the challenges that the regulators are facing and the increasing workloads with limited global regulatory resources, we can see that all this duplication of efforts and it doesn't bring the best efficiency. So the solution really are, and we've heard quite a few already today, in terms of work sharing, joint assessment, average pathway, strength and collaboration. So it's very important to try to work together and make best use of the expertise and the resources. So how can we implement reliance? First of all, it's a voluntary participation. So sometimes we hear that there's people are reluctant and they say, oh, the legal framework are different, it's too difficult. I think there is always a potential and a possibility to work together. So it's a voluntary participation, and we've seen many pilots in terms of trying to work together, even if we don't have the same legal framework. We do have to change the mindset. So maybe the way the regulators have been working for years, we have to look at more innovative ways of working. We should start small and we should learn by doing. So it's true that we can't change the whole paradigm at once, but we can see that by starting some pilots and starting to see how we can work together, that will help to change the picture gradually. And last but not least, we know that harmonization, and we've seen this today, that harmonization is a great facilitator, but it's not a prerequisite. So again, we shouldn't wait for everything to be harmonized and everything to be convergent, because that could take some time. So we have to make sure that we can start and work share, for example, as early as possible. Next slide, please. So for post-authorization changes, what are the principles? They are the same principle as for any reliance approach. First, I should mention, and Andrew mentioned it in introduction, we did a survey 3 years ago through the International Regulator Pharmaceutical Program to look at where was reliance used within the regulators. And indeed, we could see that it was used a lot for initial authorization and for good practices, so good manufacturing practices, for example. But there is a great potential to use reliance in post-authorization changes and also in monitoring and other activities. So what are the principles? The principles are the same, is to try to reduce duplication where possible. So if there is an assessment already from stringent regulatory authorities, maybe we can use that, or we could do work sharing as for the pilot that we've heard about today. The very important aspect is the risk-based approach. Where should we use the resources? And again, we shouldn't try to duplicate, and we should try to use the resources when they are most needed. For example, for an authority instead of using resources to reassess something that's already been assessed, maybe to concentrate on local manufacturer that they are the only one to oversee. And one very important aspect also is where do we use, or which reference authorities do we have to use? And you know that we are shifting from the concept of stringent regulatory authorities to WHO listed authorities. And I will mention this a bit later in my presentation. So just to highlight, we've seen many examples already today, but for example, there are also some of the middle-sized regulatory authorities are very efficient, and Singapore, HSA Singapore is one of them, and they've got, for example, an abridged and verification routes with shorter timelines for quality and product labels, packs from when they can get access to reference authority information. Okay, I can't see my slide anymore, but there's also the ICMA pilot that we've seen, and also later on today there will be the presentation for some more post-authorization changing pilots. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is just to illustrate that the example of alliance, they can be applied at all the steps of the life cycle of the products in terms of development, so clinical trial application, registration, vigilance, post-authorization, etc., but also for good practice inspection, for batch release, and for post-market control. Next slide, please. Just a few words, and Diane also mentioned it. So just to highlight, reliance, as we know, is not a new concept, and there was a long history of trying to improve the efficiency through reliance. But I think COVID-19 was a strong accelerator, and we could see that a natural chain of reliance was put in place. So really early in the process, we realized that no one is safe unless everyone is safe. So the COVAX collaborative initiative was put in place and co-led by CEPI, Gavi, WHO, and UNICEF, in terms of trying to facilitate a more equitable access to vaccine globally. And just to illustrate, the natural chain of reliance was put in place from the first approval or emergency use listing. And the first vaccine that, for example, that was emergency use listed on the WHO from the WHO pre-qualification was the Pfizer vaccine. And this was only 10 days after the EMA scientific opinion. And this was possible because there was a strong collaboration between EMA and other regulators and also WHO in terms of sharing and giving the opportunities for the open initiative to participate in the assessment, to participate in the scientific discussion. So that allows for a quick turnaround for the EUL process. And from the EUL process, then to facilitate the in-country registration, we can look at the first rollout through the COVAX, and this was the AstraZeneca vaccine in February, March 2021. And from the date of the EUL, we had 101 countries that gave either authorization for use or import permits in their country within 15 days. So this is quite an achievement when we know that in some countries, usually the authorization takes a long time. This concept of reliance was not only used for the initial authorization, but it was used for any of the post-authorization changes. So in terms of new manufacturing sites, in terms of shelf life extension, in terms of new indication, etc. I've put here a link to an article that was published in August that details from the regulators from the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Program, where it describes a bit more about all this reliance approach during the COVID-19 response. Next slide, please. What we can highlight also is the example of the WHO collaborative registration procedure for pre-qualified medicine. So as you know, the pre-qualification aims to ensure access to key health products that meets global standard of quality, safety, and efficacy, and in order to optimize the use of health resources and improve health outcomes. So really it's to give access to good quality products globally. And the WHO pre-qualification collaborative registration procedure facilitate the in-country registration by providing the assessment report and the inspection reports from the pre-qualification team. It's a good example of reliance where countries can rely on the assessment and the inspection for pre-qualification. The NRAs are then invited to reach a decision within 90 days. And when we look at how the post-authorization changes are managed through the CRP, we can see that we facilitate as well the post-authorization change management. So usually when a variation is submitted to PQ, the companies, they have 30 days to submit this variation as well to the national regulatory authorities, and the WHO PQ team promptly or proactively share the outcome of the variation assessment reports to facilitate the work of the NRAs. And then within 30 days, the NRAs indicate if the variation is approved or not. So there's really an aim to facilitate the initial authorization, but also to keep the consistency and facilitate post-authorization changes. And by using that, the harmonized product status is kept during the life cycle of the product. Next slide, please. So what's very important, and it has come up already, is the sameness of products. So there is no good reliance approach if we can't ensure that the product that the relying authorities has received is the same as the reference authorities. So some guidance is given in the good reliance practice. All the relevant aspects should be considered, and the results of the supporting safety, efficacy, and quality data should be the same. There might be some justified potential differences, and we know that, for example, the requirements are not fully harmonized globally. So we acknowledge the fact that there might be some differences in terms of dossier requirements. However, the background information should be the same. We know that the role of the manufacturer is essential here because they are the ones that know their products best in terms of which products which go to which markets. So it's very important to be clear upfront and to highlight any differences. And for post-authorization changes and vigilance to use reliance, it's very important to try to keep this sameness through the life cycle of the product. Next slide, please. One of the very important aspects is transparency. So transparency is one of the 9 good regulatory practice principles, and NRA should conduct transparent regulatory operation and decision-making. So really, NRAs are encouraged to publish their assessment reports and also their decision-making for post-authorization activities. The manufacturer are also invited to share, where possible, the unredacted assessment reports with the NRAs. When they know they want to use reliance, they should use all the reports that they have available to facilitate the assessment from the relying authority. There is always a possibility also to check with the reference NRA. What I want to highlight here as well is to share assessment report and inspection report is one thing. But as we've seen for the example of COVID-19, to be part of the scientific discussion, to listen to the shortcoming of the application, and to be part of the discussion and the scientific step for approval, it helps. So we've got many initiatives where some target NRAs are involved in the decision process and in the assessment that facilitate also the further registration or post-approval changes in countries. Next slide, please. The last thing I want to highlight is we've mentioned we are changing from the stringent regulatory authorities concept and definition. So stringent regulatory authorities was defined as part of the membership of the ICH before 2015. And you know, we're moving towards the WHO listed authorities, and I've put the link there to the interim list of WHO listed authority. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. And so this to show the link with the reliance. So from, so as mentioned, we use the global benchmarking tool to assess the maturity level of the regulatory authorities. And for those that are maturity level 3 or 4, they can apply to be listed at the WHO listed authority. So there's an additional step in terms of checking the performance and the key regulatory outputs of these regulatory authorities to be listed as the WLA. And this will give a transparent and evidence-based reference system for regulatory authorities to know which authorities they can use as reference. Some documents have been published already. So in March 2022, we've got the policy, so the general policy for the WLA, and also the framework in terms of how the performance evaluation for the definition of WLA is performed. So in the chat, I should have mentioned, yes, there will be, because we know that sameness is a very key component of reliance, and there will be a dedicated session tomorrow morning about tomorrow, depending on your time zone, but tomorrow regarding the sameness and how to define the sameness of product in terms of reliance. Next slide, please. So just a few messages. As we've seen, we see an increasing role of reliance for pack management, and it's very welcome. We have to ensure, for any reliance approach, the sameness of the products. Transparency is a very key and important aspect of facilitating reliance, because the regulatory authorities should have access to the assessment and inspection reports. And lastly, the WLA will offer a transparent and evidence-based reference to know which reference authorities can be used. Next slide, please. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I will be very happy to take any question. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marie. Super talk, really, really interesting. Absolutely, I noted as well that you were talking about harmonization is not a prerequisite, should indeed just start. And I think we'll move on to the next presentation, because Lynn Lepelaire from Sanofi, Sanofi did just that. They did just start. And they've got a nice example of a post-approval change reliance pathway. And we'll then take some questions maybe at the end. We've got some good questions coming in, but we'll do the questions later. But let's first focus on this next presentation. So Lynn, tell us about this this reliance path pilot that you set up.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the ability to present this pilot today. So in the coming minutes, I will share with you the post-approval change regulatory reliance pilot that was launched by Sanofi. As Marie just said, we learn by doing. So in 2019, we decided at Sanofi to initiate a pilot, not on a new product, but on a legacy vaccines, which is WHO pre-qualified. And we decided to make the change on a transfer from this vaccine from one filling site to another filling site. So it is initially, and it is currently manufactured and filled in Canada, and we will transfer this product in France. So this change impacts 37 countries in the world. And we assess with our experience that it would take 4 years to get prior approval for this post-approval change. And what we're trying to do with this pilot is actually to reduce this timeline to 6 months once we've shared the unredacted assessment report of Health Canada with all the other NRAs impacted by this change. So there's an impact in terms of manufacturing side, but there's also an impact for this change on the release side and the release authorities, therefore. So Health Canada is currently releasing our batches, and in the future, because the batches will be and the products will be manufactured in Europe, the NRA responsible to release this product will be a European authority, and indeed the PI, so the Paul-Ehrlich Institute, the German authorities will release the batches. So what we're trying to do with this pilot, and I'm going to give you through the coming minutes the recipe we use and the barriers we encountered is basically to test harmonization, to really make some tests and to conclude on what can be done and what can't be done. We really hope to be able to scale up this kind of processes in the future in order to ensure that we don't have any product disruption and that our vaccine can access patients as soon as possible. So next slide, please. So we initiated this pilot 3 years ago, and we had a phase of engagement in 2021-2022. So far, approximately half of the countries, so 51% of the countries, accepted to participate to the pilot. You can see on this screen that these countries are spread all around the world, and in Asia, Taiwan, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore accepted to join this pilot. Some countries decline for different reasons that I will explain later, and some countries haven't yet responded to our proposal. Next slide, please. So we do have 8 success factors identified for this pilot. One is the standard dossier. We decided to send the exact same dossier made on the EU CTD, including some WHO and Health Canada requirements to all the NRAs. So it's one set of requirements for all the countries with an identical timeline. So there will be a unique timeline for all countries to review the dossier, to ask their question to Sanofi, and a unique timeline for Sanofi to share the answer. We also have the idea of bringing additional transparency to this process, meaning that all the questions asked by the NRAs and all the answers provided by Sanofi will be available in a unique document. And if possible, we'll try even to share them along the way to avoid duplication of questions and additional work for the NRAs. Next slide, please. So the 4 other factors that we identify as success factors are the language. The dossier will be in English. So except for the administrative part, the module 1, which could be translated in local languages, all the content will be the same, as I said, and even in terms of language. There will be reliance made on the unredacted assessment report from Health Canada. So Health Canada agreed to share, and we, Sanofi, agreed to share the unredacted assessment report with all the other NRAs, which will allow, according to us, this fast review compared to the initial timeline. We will also ask the NRA to proceed to reliance on the GMP inspection certificate issued by ANSM, the French authorities. What I need to tell you maybe as well is that in these 37 countries, all these 37 countries already know the manufacturing site, the new manufacturing site. And there will also be no testing because Health Canada considered that for this type of change, no testing is required. Next slide, please. So I told you the story started in 2019, in 2020 and 2021 until now. We are engaging the different NRAs. The pilot really kicked off in April this year, when Sanofi submitted the standard dossier to Health Canada. So we are now in the process of getting this change reviewed by Health Canada, and we are expecting the approval at the latest in December. And we even got some good news from Health Canada saying that they may even be able to give us their feedback before these dates. Once we will have the unredacted assessment report and the CPP, we will then be able, next slide, please, to transfer those data to our affiliates that will share with the different NRAs in the world. And the standard calendar will start at this point in time. So on January 17th, all the countries impacted by these changes in the world will receive our dossier. There will be 90 calendar days for them to review and to ask their questions. And then we assess that Sanofi will have 30 calendar days to answer all the questions. the answers will come back to the different NRAs, and then they will have again 30 calendar days to review the answers and either grant their approval or not grant their approval for the change. In 2024, the filling will start in the French site in Val d'Oreuil, and the filling will continue in Canada. So there will be a time during which the product will be manufactured on both manufacturing sites to allow us to perform completely the transfer, and then we will stop the manufacturing in Canada in 2025. Next slide, please. So during this pilot that is still ongoing, we've already encountered some barriers, and we had some lessons learned from the pilot. So one thing we realized is that in many countries, there's only the authorization to have one batch release site or one manufacturing site in the license, which was against the proposal of our pilot. We also identified that we needed a grace period of 18 months between the time we, the countries, the NRA approved the change and the time we could implement the change. Some countries only accept fixed period of time, as for example, 6 months or 12 months. So some of the countries therefore refused to be part of the pilot, and some countries accepted to change their grace period to include the pilot. We also faced requests for new registration. For example, when for alternate sites. And in terms of reliance, I was also saying that we were asking for reliance on the unredacted assessment report, but also on inspection, GMP inspection and documentation. And some countries were not able to rely on this documentation, even though they already know the site and they knew it was inspected by the French authorities. Next slide, please. So additionally, we encounter some difficulties in countries in which some reliance principles were already in place, because the NRAs did not want to follow our proposal that were not completely aligned with their principles. As I said, we started this pilot in 2019, so just at the beginning of the pandemic. So we, of course, had issues to connect with the different NRAs. And we also faced some changes in terms of government, in terms of contact person, which impact the pilot. Some countries also have some additional documents. And as we said, it is a unique dossier. So therefore, we couldn't answer to this request. And the final barriers that we encounter is the one country actually asked us if this country was okay to be part of a reliance pilot, but only if it could be the referent authority, which is not the case in our pilot. So this country therefore refused to join the pilot. Next slide, please. So to conclude on this pilot, we had to work, let's say, maybe first internally, because our pilot actually changed the paradigm, changed the way we're doing internally. And we had to first collaborate with Sanofi affiliates to be able to build this pilot all together. As you saw, we encountered 10 different barriers so far to actually engage different NRAs. That was not easy because of the period, but also because what we're proposing is quite different in the fact that we are proposing harmonization for all countries. And this may be difficult to adapt to the local legislation. And finally, I want to highlight the fact that we worked with some key partners that supported us and gave their advices and opinion. Health Canada, the PI from Europe, WHO, and PAO actually are supporting us to roll out this pilot and giving them their advice to make it a success. Next slide, please. So I would like to thank you, my colleagues as well from Sanofi. We are a team. I'm presenting this this pilot on behalf of a team, a core team, and also on behalf of Sanofi affiliates who are having these direct discussions with the NRAs around the world. And as a team, with all the partners I was talking about and Sanofi people, we actually are managing to make changes in the way we will submit this this post-approval change. So thank you very much for this time, and if you do have any question, please do not hesitate to ask them.
Thank you very much, Lynn. That was super. As I said, this is a real example of reliance in practice, and it's superb to see. So, Thierry, do we have any questions? We've got a couple of minutes, I think, for questions.
Yeah,
I know there's some interesting ones coming up.
Yeah, well, just on time. That's perfect. First, but actually, there were a couple of questions on the WLA countries, etc. But I saw that Mary and Sergio responded into the Q&A box, and then there is only one question remaining to Lynn. The question is, how did Sanofi initiate the pilot with the health authorities?
We initiated the pilot. I'm not sure if we're talking about the different NRAs in the world or if we initiated the pilot with the Health Canada. So I'm going to answer to both. We first initially started to have a discussion with Health Canada and the PI in 2019 to explain them what we were thinking about and asking them for their advice and their opinion. So this is for the, I would say, the release authorities. For the different NRAs, we built a package. We also collected some testimonies, for example, from WHO, from Health Canada, and from the PI, giving their opinion and their point of view on what we were doing. So we gave both information to the NRAs, and our affiliates actually requested for meetings, or we send emails or letters, as well as those videos, because at that time we were in the middle of the COVID. So we mainly use videos and video conferences, emails, to make a proposal to the different NRAs.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. I think that's it, Andrew, and I think we can go for the break now.
Okay, well, thank you, Thierry. That's super. Yeah, no, again, thank you to both speakers. Very interesting presentations around reliance, and we'll explore a little bit more about reliance in the last session in the panel. We've now got a little break for you, just 5 minutes. So please don't go away. Please come back again in 5 minutes' time. But while you do, we've also got a video about the World Bank training. The World Bank have set up a training, a PAC training on post-approval changes. It's open to all. It's open to regulators. It's open to industry. If you want to know more about PACs, you should do this. You should do this training. And there's a video of it in the break, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes. So please don't go away. Watch the video. Take a short break, and be back in 5 minutes. Thank you all, everybody.
My name is Lubna Jamam, and I'm a consultant at the World Bank Group. Today, I would like to present you a free online training developed by the World Bank in collaboration with IFPMA. The post-approval changes to marketing authorization is part of the World Bank Group activities to support strengthening regulatory system worldwide. This training, based on WHO guidelines, serves as a foundation for post-approval changes and helps familiarize the participant with specific technical provisions for medicines and vaccines. It also provides a good understanding of the value of regulatory convergence and reliance. This free, open access and self-paced training is available in English, in French and Spanish. To access the training, regulators and policymakers can register via the Moodle, an online learning platform, while participants from the industry, academia, NGOs, and other stakeholders can register via the DI website. The links and the instruction to access the platform will be provided at the end of the session. We hope you register for the course and benefit from its content. And please do not hesitate to share with your network. Thank you so much.
So we'll start in 1 minute. Just before we start and move towards the next part of the session, I just would like personally to apologize because it seems that I had a little lag time into the synchronization of the Q&A from the previous session. And in fact, there were many more questions than only one question to the pilots, the Sanofi pilots. So apologize, I didn't see that before the break, but so Lynn will try actually to answer most, if not all, the questions into the Q&A. So with that said, welcome back to the last part, second part of the session, and the third one here before the panel discussion. This is actually risk-based approaches, and actually we speak at this moment about a lot, and we spoke a lot in the frame of the COVID situation about risk-based approaches. But here, this is not really specific to COVID, but this is actually more related to the way we can manage post-approval changes, in particular related to what could be managed within the pharmaceutical quality system. So in that respect, so I'm pleased to welcome Kevin O'Donnell and Lyndall Brennan. I didn't see Lyndon, but she might join soon, I guess. So
hello, I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. So so welcome to Kevin and Lyndall. So Kevin is Market Compliance Manager at the Irish HPRA, so the Health Product Regulatory Authority. He's the chairperson of the PICS, so the Pharmaceutical Inspection Coordination Scheme Expert Circle on QRM, the Quality Risk Management. And Kevin is also the rapporteur for the ongoing revision of the ICH Q9 on quality risk management. With regards to Lyndall Brennan, so Lyndall Brennan is calling from Australia. So she's a GMP inspector from the inspections section at the TGA, so the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia. She's a member of the coordinating committee of the PICS Expert Circle on QRM. So thank you both of you for joining, and I'll leave you the floor.
Thank you very much, Thierry. I'm Kevin. I hope that you can hear me and see me okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Thanks so much. Hello, everybody. I'm Kevin from Ireland, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you here today at this very good IFPMA meeting. So thank you very much for inviting me here today, colleagues. So this is a very brief presentation. Would you go to the next slide, please? This is a very brief presentation on a PICS paper, which is supporting post-approval change management in the context of just regular change management, but also in the context of ICH Q12. So I was asked to speak on this topic with my colleague Lyndall. So Lyndall and I are going to share this presentation. I will start for about 8 or maybe 10 minutes. Lyndall will come in then I'll come in to finish it off. We just really wanted to tell you about this PICS paper. For those of you who may not be that familiar with PICS, PICS is a Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme. This is basically a network of GMP and GDP inspectorates around the world. There are about 54, I think, inspectorates, members of PICS, with a number to join in the coming years as well. So one of the key things which PICS does is to do training for GMP inspectors and to publish guidances for inspectors as well. This paper we're showing on screen is a guidance for GMP inspectors. It is titled How to Evaluate and Demonstrate the Effectiveness of a Pharmaceutical Quality System Relating to Risk-Based Change Management. And the title is a bit strange because it is about evaluating and demonstrating, and the demonstrating part relates to industry. This paper is equally applicable to industry. We wrote it with industry colleagues who contributed to it. And so this paper is basically a tool which inspectors can use to evaluate how strong a company's risk-based change management system is. Plus, it's a tool which companies can use to demonstrate to their inspectors the robustness and the effectiveness of their risk-based change management system. So what is this going to do with post-approval changes? Well, I guess post-approval changes are often based on change management activities in manufacturing plants. And there is reference, of course, to change control and effective change control in the GMPs. But there is also reference to it in ICS Q10 and ICS Q12. You will know that Q12 really requires companies, before they can access the regulatory flexibilities which are in Q12, it does require them to have robust change management systems in place which are risk-based. And so this paper is a means to give companies a tool to demonstrate that to the regulatory inspectors. So I'm going to run through the paper. We just maybe move to the next slide, please. And so this is just the outline of the paper. Linda is going to focus on the actual guidance, section number 5, but I'm going to just run through the initial parts of it. Next slide, please. So this is just a very brief introduction. It speaks about how this document gives practical guidance for GMP inspectors when inspecting risk-based change management processes, and it speaks about what things are included there. It's important to say that this document is not introducing any new GMP requirement for companies. That's in point 2.2. Next slide, please, is a few points regarding the purpose of the document. It is to give guidance on this topic, of course, and 3.2 and 3.3 just are references from the PICS GMP guide regarding the need for companies to demonstrate PQS effectiveness. And you know that in ICS Q10, that concept of demonstrating PQS effectiveness in order to access regulatory flexibilities is right there within Appendix 1 of Q10. We have that appendix at the end of this paper as well. Section 3.3 there then speaks about change management and risk-based change management. Next slide, please. This is a slide which just speaks about how the guidance is structured. So I won't go into this very much because Linda is going to speak about this. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is the most important slide maybe from my perspective in relation to post-approval changes. So this slide is speaking, 3.5 says that it is considered that the application by a company of the guidance in section 5 below, which Linda will speak about, will provide evidence of the effectiveness of the PQS in relation to risk-based change management. That's a very strong statement. It is basically saying that the PICS inspectors worldwide have said if companies applied this guidance, that will be enough evidence to support the conclusion that a company's change management system is effective and is risk-based, and hopefully that then will enable companies to achieve some of the flexibilities which about in Q10 and in Q12. Section 3.6 speaks about Q10. It mentions how Q10 has an appendix which links PQS effectiveness with risk-based regulatory oversight, and that means regulatory flexibility. And 3.6 also makes reference to Q12, which is about risk-based post-approval change management and the important role that a PQS has in supporting that flexibility. So we do hope that this paper is useful. Next slide, please. So this slide just then highlights what the scope of the document is. It's a very wide scope. It speaks about manufacturers of medicinal products and active ingredients to the inspections of those. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Linda, who is going to go through her own slides. And I think Linda is going to speak about what the guidance actually is in this document. I know that Linda's slides start a little bit later, colleagues. I think slide number 17 is where Lyndall's slide starts, I think. I'll hand over to you now, Lyndall. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if anyone can, if I'm visible. Can people see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Oh, perfect. I can't see myself. Okay, great. That's the right slide. Okay. So the main body of this document has 4 key sections, and it sort of breaks down the various key areas of change over a change or a change system. So part 1, this one is really around the proposal, and it defines when a change is needed. So in this section, there's a number of change triggers that are listed, and that spans the product life cycle, and that starts with new product introduction and through to changes in the manufacturing equipment, facility and process changes, innovation changes, and right through to the end of the life cycle with decommissioning steps. So really this talks about if the change is not set up or adequately set up at this point and documented appropriately, then at this point you might not have the right subject matter experts involved. The benefits of the change may not be clear to the stakeholders. The justification of the change decision won't be appropriately documented to ensure that's really around not only the adequate knowledge management at the site that's making the change, but it's also supporting discussions when you have regulatory inspections. So that upfront documentation of all those areas of the change is really important. So when we talk about the change proposal, there's some really key aspects there. So we have to ensure that the change documentation is generated in a timely manner, and that's really foundational for all the next steps. So if it's not set up in a timely manner, you can be squeezed, and some of this next critical steps won't be done as effectively as they could be. So once it's set up appropriately, your critical information can then be formally documented, and there's 4 central points to that. There's the objective of the change. So what are we hoping to achieve? The scope of that change, so what's included in the change, and of the outcomes and the benefits of that change. So they're the 4 central points that you need to document up front. The impact of the change is a really important part here to understand what the impact of the change is, and that's including the impact on pending or approved filings and any regulatory commitments you might have. And that has to be assessed, and there has to be a justification for a go, no-go decision in terms of whether we would go forward with that change or not. And that has to be documented formally. Ensure that the right subject matter experts and the right stakeholders are involved, so that there's a broad review of all, and where relevant, part of the approval process to have those people involved. So that's part 1, that's the change proposal, or that's the first section. So if you go to the next slide, please. So the next part talks to the assessment of the risk that's associated with a change. And this can be often where a change process falls over. Risks are often not comprehensively identified, and also, once identified, appropriately mitigated. So firstly, a risk-based classification of the change can be assigned, and usually you see this as a critical change, a major change, or a minor change. That's usually how it's defined, and it's a good way to define it. And in that way, then you can start to determine if the more complex or the more significant changes, so potentially the critical or majors, will require a more formal risk assessment, which really defines what could go wrong and the impact of the change. There are a number of requirements listed here for the risk assessments, and I think key to all of these is really essential to this part is that they must be founded on appropriate science and they must be knowledge-based. So assess the risk benefits to product quality and safety. Obviously, that's the obvious one. Assess the risk benefits to other products, processes, and systems that you might have in the facility, that you might be coming online in the facility in future. Identify and document the risk controls. So really important to say, these are our risks, how are we going to control them? And data is important here to really support that risk evaluation. And that links into that science-based assessment. So overall, and this is an important point that's made in this document, overall we should see that the change should reduce patient safety, product quality risks to an acceptable level. So, and that they should maintain or improve product quality or patient safety and not increase process variability. So that's a really nice sort of check-in at this stage to make sure that that's really the case for the change that's being made. And it's an overarching consideration for all changes when it's being progressed. So, so if we go to the next slide, so that's now the risk process. Now after the next, in step 3, we really talk about change planning and change implementation. So once the risk assessment's been done, the benefits and the risks have been identified and the controls also identified, then we start with the planning and the implementation of the change in this 3rd section. So this section is really directed by the outcome of the risk assessment. So the risk assessment will direct the planning, the whole prioritization, the implementation, and all their respective timelines. So upfront planning, it talks to, is required to determine the data that's needed. So at this point, we need to really decide what data we will need to demonstrate that this change has been effectively implemented. And the acceptance criteria for that, and going past that, the change effectiveness criteria. So to really understand, has this change been effective? So really understanding what data will be needed at this point, not at a later date. So then there's the implementation process. So again, we have to circle back to that risk assessment and ensure that the risks were identified and managed, making sure that any interim controls as part of that change process or any short-term measures or overall risk control measures are in place in a timely manner so that any risks that were identified in that assessment are not realized at this point. That's really important. Here at this stage, ensuring that the approvals are all documented and are in place. And the change management process has really not worked effectively if changes are implemented prior to approval of the change. So the upfront approval and input from all the subject matter experts, stakeholders, and critical authorizers has all happened before we start implementing the change. At this point also, reviewing the relevant risk assessments, make sure they're updated, making sure regulatory filings are updated, and the marketing authorization holders communicated to where it's appropriate. So update and communicate at this point. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So this is then around after the implementation of the change. This is the change review and the effectiveness, and this can be a misstep. So it's really important that all the parts of this post-change are really just before and after change closure are really a focus for the sites. It's often missed. So prior to the change closure, It's important to ensure the changes meet the objective that was defined in the change proposal. So we're circling back again and making sure that all our criteria are met. And the predefined acceptance criteria that we talked about in the previous section and the effectiveness criteria are actually achieved. So that's the point of going back to those, making sure they're achieved. If not, we're making sure that any deviations were assessed, they're managed, they're justified, and you follow up any measures that are defined as part of this deviation. Change effectiveness, again, where possible, should be supported by that quantitative data, and any residual risks that are identified are managed to acceptable levels, and procedural controls are implemented at this stage. Unintended risks that may have been introduced are evaluated here and documented, mitigated, and either mitigated or accepted, and then, of course, any accepted risks to be monitored. Just prior to or after change closure, there's some post-implementation actions that might arise from deviations or CAPAs, and any relevant risk assessments are updated following this effectiveness assessment. Product knowledge is incorporated into SOPs and reports. So they're the key facts there. It's really important. So there's 4 key steps in the risk-based and a risk-based change management system. It's a fully documented and reviewed proposal, a risk assessment that's commensurate with the complexity of the level of impact of that change, adequate planning and seamless implementation to ensure the risks are not realised. Formal review or risks have been mitigated and monitored to ensure the continued control. Okay, I think over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Linda. And I'm just checking, as a theorist, can you hear me and see me okay still?
I can at least hear you. I cannot see you, but I can at least see. Yes, I think it's coming. But we can hear you.
But okay, I've switched my camera back on. Hopefully you can see me
That's
again.
okay. We can see you now.
Great. Okay, so I know we just have about 3 or 4 minutes left, so I will stay on time. So just a few concluding remarks. So this document was developed in PICS from 2018 to 2021. We published it in 2021, so it went through quite a long consultation process within PSCS. Then in 2021 also, the Q12 training group within PICS ran a major training event on this topic, how to understand and support Q12 for regulatory inspectors. So many inspectors attended that training in May 2021, and a large component of that training was this PICS paper. So we just want to make the point to our industry colleagues that we have done training with GMP inspectors on this paper, so we are encouraging inspectors to use it. And I would like to encourage you as industry colleagues to speak about it to your regulatory inspectors as well, and maybe try and use it. We do hope that it will support the implementation of risk-based post-approval change management and the Q12 flexibilities in general. And it was actually developed taking the guidance in Q12 into account. You know that in Q12 there is an appendix 2 to the document which lists, I think, 12 principles of change management. So we took each of those 12 principles into account when writing this paper. So to conclude, the adherence to this guidance should provide sufficient evidence of an effective science and risk-based approach to change management, and it should drive, hopefully, risk reduction where possible, as Linda said, maybe better patient protection as well, continual improvement, and hopefully it will let companies have a means of accessing the flexibilities which are offered now by ICH Q12 in relation to post-approval changes. So that's it. I just would like to thank the industry colleagues who did participate with the PICS group in developing this paper up until 2021. So I'll just hand back to you, Thierry. Thank you again for the opportunity for Lyndall and myself to speak to you here this morning. And I wish you a very good rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. Just before we move on to the next presentation, I just would like to add one single comment, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin and Lyndall, but my understanding also is there is a big change in paradigm in the way that the same change, I mean the exact same change, may be considered differently depending on the PQS effectiveness of the company. So if company A has an effective PQS, I mean, this could enable actually to manage this change within the PQS compared maybe to another company which is not able to demonstrate an effective PQS, and then the same change may deserve some reporting. Is that correct understanding?
Yes,
ultimately.
Is the general understanding that although it does boil down, I guess, to what happens regionally within variation regulation and other things. So within Europe, you might know that Q12 has not yet been implemented into the variations framework. So we don't quite know yet how that is going to pan out. But yes, that is the idea behind the concepts in Q12 and in this paper as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for the clarification. So let's move on now to the last presentation of today's session before we move to the panel discussion. So this will be about the industry experience of using risk-based approaches for post-approval changes. And I will lead the floor to Parag Nagarkar. So Parag is the head of Global Regulatory Affairs at the Serum Institute of India. So the floor is yours, Parag.
Hello all. Greetings of the day. Thank you very much, Thierry, and thank you, organizing committee, for inviting me to share some thoughts here.
Parag, I think I cannot see you.
My video.
Switch on your video,
sure.
maybe?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I've done it. Thank you very much. Perfect. So thank you again, Thierry, and thank you to the organizing committee. So what I'm going to share is some of the examples what we have seen it, and we have used the risk management based approach for handling the post-approval changes within our company. So this is an introduction slide. Risk-based approach is an opportunity to optimize really science and risk-based post-approval change processes to maximize benefits from innovation and continual improvements. We saw some of the examples in part one of today from two speakers giving some examples how this has been used successfully in their organizations. With a common understanding of risk-based approaches, the post-approval changes can be effectively managed in the PQS, so that more changes can be managed in the PQS via notification pathways instead of a post-approval approval changes, utilizing enhanced science and of course risk-based regulatory strategies, which are outlined in ICH 10, 12, and you will see in the next slide. A specific post-approval change may be categorized differently depending on the level of knowledge, risk controls, and the PQS effectiveness. The outcomes of the risk assessment is derived on change planning, prioritization, implementation, and the timelines. The accuracy of the risk assessment associated with the post-approval change should be in line with the complexity and on the criticality of the change. Now, coming to this slide, you will see an integration between, I have considered ICH Q8, which is the pharmaceutical development related activities, then the ICH Q9, QRM related activities, ICH Q10, which is the pharmaceutical quality system related activities, and of course, the most recent product life cycle management, ICH Q12. All these, when you look at it, when we do the risk-based approach, we look at each one of them and divide it into two parts. One is the commercial scale manufacturing, and the second is the continual process verification. We call it CPV, and the continual improvement. So we look at it from the two axes, each one of them, and try to make the risk-based approach based on the data points which have been generated all over the Q8, Q9, Q10, and the Q11. We just heard Q10, how important it is to capture as part of the change control your robust pharmaceutical quality system to capture the changes and to evaluate them and of course see the effectiveness of them too. If you can move to the next slide, please. Again, a little bit about risk-based approach and why it is essential. So as we know, many post-approval changes, they require regulatory agency approval by individual countries. We saw a very good case where Sanofi is trying to work on a reliance-based approach and see how these approvals can be fastened, basically. So because of the global regulatory complexity, individual post-approval changes usually takes years or for full worldwide approval, even when they reduce patient risk, improve compliance, or enhance the manufacturing process or the test methods. This global complexity slows down the continual improvement, innovation, and of course causes drug shortages and the current GMP compliance issues too. So the risk-based approach enables effective management of the post-approval changes within the PQS using the product and the process knowledge. And what we saw, ICH Q8, 9, 10 actually helps basically to evaluate such changes effectively. Now, upon implementation, the risk-based approach further reduces the regulatory burden on the post-approval changes and allows the regulatory agencies and the companies to focus on the changes that are at a higher risk to the product quality and as it relates to the patient safety and efficacy. When a PAC is needed, most of the organizations find themselves in a dilemma as the CGMP compliance is prerequisite in certain countries and requires an approval in the same or other countries before implementation. And when I mean the other countries, it's the reliance they have on these other countries before implementation. Now, moving to the next slide. Next slide, please. So a couple of slides, it just gives you what we use as risk assessment procedure. So we do have a standard format. We use it for the process, to use this process for performing risk assessment. So each change has a set of specific assumptions and a list of possible negative events are developed for each change. So the severity, frequency, and the level of detectability are evaluated for each negative event using the risk assessment scale. And the type of data needed to support the change are identified and used when considering the level of detectability. As the factors are dependent with each other, the overall risk level is determined by multiplying the factors together. So the very first one is given the severity of events. That's the consequence, and you will see 1 to 4 levels for them. On the next slide, please. You have the other two parameters, the frequency estimation, which actually is the likelihood of event occurring. Again, the values are 1 to 4, and the last one is the level of detectability. The values are 1 to 3. Remember, the detectability is based on the in-process, release testing, and the data needed to support the change. Next slide, please. This just shows you basically when you calculate the risk, that is severity multiplied by frequency multiplied by level of detectability, you get a number basically. And those numbers, if you put it and what does that number means to you in terms of whether it's a minor, moderate, or major reportable category. Next slide, please. Now I'll take you to two examples quickly. If we move to the next slide. So example one is it's in pandemic vaccine process changes. So on the top side of the table or the slide, you have the following changes which were proposed in the manufacturing process of drug substance. So modification of the approved cell count, cell viability criteria during upstream process, change to the approved infection process or the approved multiplicity of infection MOI, changes to the buffer and media preparation steps and the process scales, changes to the pH of the cell suspension during cell expansion and production in bioreactors, and change to the temperature during post-infection. Of course, there were several changes associated with the upstream of the drug substance, and this was for one of the pandemic vaccine we had in last like 1.5 years back. As part of the risk assessment, what we looked at, of course, various parameters, but there were no changes observed in other critical process parameters that directly impacts the critical quality attributes of the in-process intermediates or the final purified DS. And most importantly, there was no change to the downstream purification process. So it remained unchanged. So next slide, please. So as part of the risk assessment of this change, you will see the possible events. So A, B, C, D were the possible events, and they were categorized for severity, which is the consequences, frequency, which is the likelihood of event occurring, and then of course the detection, which is the level of detectability. And you multiply S, F, and D, and you get a risk level. So the highest risk level is considered, that is 12. And as if you go back a little bit, 12 means it's a prior approval. However, to overcome based on the risk assessment, a post-approval change management protocol was submitted as part of the initial dossier with a clear present and the proposed detail with a detailed comparability assessment plan. Details regarding the data generation to support the process change was also included. And of course, we had the DOE or the engineering runs data. So we did have some confidence with the data based on which the protocol, the comparability protocol was prepared, and this was submitted. So after completion, this change was submitted as part of a rolling review to key agencies in emerging countries. And as compliance, response, or commitments, there were no prior approval required by various agencies, of course, from India, WHO, Health Canada, and of course, outcome, as you can see, it's much uninterrupted supply of a much needed pandemic vaccine batches manufactured using this impacted changes. So that's one example. Now I do have a second example. If you go to the next slide, please. And it's, yeah. And it's regarding a scale up of a drug substance. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you very much. So the next slide is talks about example 2, which is a scale up of drug substance. And in this example, you will see there's a linear scale up of a drug substance manufacturing. Again, upstream from 50 liters to 500 liters. The change was initiated just before submission of the BLA and was communicated to FDA in a pre-BLA submission meeting. Of course, as part of the risk assessment, a comparability protocol was submitted. It was with the analytical comparability plan. It was submitted as part of the BLA, and it was discussed with FDA as part of the pre-BLA meeting. Risk assessment, these are the 3 possible events. So the S, F, and D was calculated. And again, as we saw earlier, the comparability protocol was submitted. The change was submitted as a CB 30 rather than a post-approval change. So we got basically approval quite quickly than 4 to 6 months. So that was a significant time achieved or gained with this approach. So the last slide of my talk is, can we move to the last slide? Yeah, so changes which are managed in the PQS and some of the examples basically. So these are the examples where changes have been managed in the PQS without submitting a post-approval change to any regulatory authorities. And some of the changes, of course, are given below. There are two where I would like to emphasize. One is the equipment replacement like to like, and there is another one, change in the supplier of sterile filter when the MOC is same and the filtration is intended for the buffers or process intermediate. So these two, definitely we are doing it for India, WHO and rest of the world, but we are working towards the EU or the US FDA reporting for these two. So with that, I do come to end of my presentation. Next slide, please. So thank you for your patience. Thank you, Thierry, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Parag. Very interesting presentation, and also with real life case studies. So this is always very helpful to have concrete examples. Just would like maybe to add one little thing before I turn it over to Andrew for the questions. It's about the fact that there should be also quite a number, and you illustrated it very well in your last slide, that there should be actually quite a number, and a big number of actually post-approval changes which could be managed within the PQS when in the case when the risk is considered as very low or negligible. So as per, by the way, ICH 212. So Andrew, so about we have just 1 minute or two, I mean, for the Q&As before we move to the panel.
Yeah, we've had a few Q&As in this session. There's a comment actually. We've got one comment, Thierry, and maybe the two presenters might want to, the three presenters might want to comment on this. The comment is, although I see the effort to implement PQS and post-approval changes, a large part of the change assessment is also dependent on regulatory authority PAC guidelines. So I guess really it's kind of looking ahead. I mean, how do we see this, further use of PQS in conjunction with some of these regulatory authority PAC guidelines?
I don't know, maybe Kevin, do you have a...
So Thierry, you want me to answer?
Oh, all right, yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. So as we just saw on the last slide, and Thierry, you picked up that, is we need to have a continuous conversation with the authorities. And I mean really starting with the stringent regulatory authorities. And I just gave two examples where the equipment is like to like, right? And the industry has huge data to really create a risk assessment for such. So these are some of the examples, the filter change for buffers or process intermediates. So these are the changes where we need to have dialogue and basically approach some of the stringent regulatory authorities so that you take that example and then build it so that other, like India, WHO, or rest of the world agencies can rely. It's again reliance. So you work with the stringent regulatory authorities and help the other authorities to rely on those decisions. So that's all. It's continuous working with these authorities.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, as Kevin, and would you like me to come in here, Thierry, please?
Yep.
Yes, I understand how the comment was that guidance is needed for industry by the regulatory authorities regarding, the expectations regarding post-approval changes. And yes, I fully agree with that. Guidance is needed. And it is a complicated area, though. Regulations sometimes need to be changed to support the concepts of established conditions and regulatory flexibility, which are in Q12. And in Europe, where I work, the regulatory framework does need to be legally changed to include those things. I would imagine if and when that happens, guidance will be published for industry regarding the how to manage post approvals in that Q12 context.
Yeah, and maybe I can add myself that, and I don't know if Mary can comment on that, by the way, but also at one point in time, also the WHO guideline should reflect also this. I mean, the ICH Q12 and Q9 elements.
Yeah.
All right. I don't think that there is any other comments or questions. At least. Oh yes. Sorry. I definitely have a little bit lag time with my synchronization.
Right. We perhaps need to move right to the last part.
Yes. So. So maybe this is maybe a good segue to the panel discussion. We are just on time, Andrew.
Yeah, we are. We're just on time now. Thank you, Thierry. Yeah, so we're going to move on now to the last part, which is the panel discussion, and I'd like to invite the panelists to join me. So we've got Marie. And I'll introduce the panelists in a short while. But basically what we wanted to do today was really, as you've heard today, we focused on three main areas for solutions around convergence and harmonization, risk-based approaches and reliance. And in the panel, what we're going to do is we're going to focus a little bit more on some of the questions around this and ask the panelists to comment further. We're also as well going to invite questions as well from the audience. I've seen some coming in. We've got a limited amount of time, so we'll see how we get on. But let's start the session. So we've got Marie Valentin, online, and we've met her previously in a previous presentation at WHO organization. We've also as well, I think we've also got Diane Wilkinson. And because I can't see everybody on my, I can see Diane now, perfect. And I know Jisoo Joyce has got some challenges with having to with another priority. So I don't know, Jisoo, are you available right now? Just let me know.
I'll try to stay as long as I can.
Brilliant. No, really, thank you very much indeed. No, that's really helpful. Thank you, Jisoo. So we've got the three panelists who you've met before, and we're going to kick off with a question. So as I say, I'm going to deal with reliance, risk-based and convergence, and we'll also take as well some questions as well from the audience. So the first one really, let's focus on reliance first of all. So we've heard about the ICRA program. We've also heard about other initiatives. One example was the Sanofi reliance example. So how can regulators and industry further expand the use of these reliance procedures, these reliance approaches to post-approval changes? So what does the panelists think of that? So let's first of all, Marie, can I invite you to give a few comments on that? So what should regulators and industry do?
Sure, thanks for that, Andrew. So I think we are at very exciting times, because I think we see that the use of reliance is exploding really, and it's very encouraging to see that different pilots are happening, because this is where we're going to learn and where we're going to set the future and the future procedure. So I think one of the important aspects is building trust. So it's working together, collaboration and building trust. Transparency, we've seen, is very important as well. Transparency in terms of what is proposed and what is the decision-making process of the different regulators. we would have to learn from these different pilots and share the best practices and see to be transparent again about the best practices and what we can put forwards and to make sure that we learn from the different pilots and learn from the different activities to promote best practices. And the last one is regarding the collaboration of all stakeholders and the dialogue. And many speakers have mentioned that it's always a dialogue. So we can be innovative, we can propose things, but it's a dialogue between obviously the industry and the regulators. But I think it's very important to keep this line of communication and working together towards finding a solution, because we're all working towards the same effort and the same goal. So I think it's very important to have this line of communication and this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Absolutely. We're all working towards the same goals for sure. So let's move to Diane next. The same question again.
Hi, Andrew. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, for me, Andrew, ever optimistic. I'm hoping we'll see the snowball effect that, as Marie said, as we put some of these things into practice and people gain trust and confidence because they'll see the data generated. So where they think they're taking some risks on some of these approaches, they'll have the confidence to see that actually the benefit outweighs the risk and actually the risk isn't materializing. So my hope is that we'll continue to learn and build. And I think for those agencies which are observing some of these ongoing reliance activities, that maybe they volunteer to participate, because it is important that we don't just it's amazing what the ICMA pilot is doing. It is going to be 3 agencies, which is great start, but if we can get more of those involved, as we're seeing in the Sanofi pilot as well, that will be really important to make sure that every patient, whichever country they're in the world, can benefit from these sort of reliance procedures, because there are solutions to these problems that we're seeing. We can no longer say no to entertaining some of this thinking.
Thank you, Diane. No, that's great. And then, well, let's move finally to Jesua, because indeed it's very interesting to have a perspective now from the Philippines. You had some super examples in the Philippines where you're really pushing forward on reliance. So what do you see as what the regulators can do more to expand the use of reliance approaches for post-approval changes?
Well, for the Philippines, and how we ended up engaging reliance is more of making sure that the products are available in the market as soon as possible without compromising safety, efficacy, and safety, efficacy, and quality. At the end, there are already a lot of, you can read through the different issuances of other countries. The National Regulatory Authority will have to be convinced in order to issue guidances. WHO can try to convince National Regulatory Authority. From our end, we had a lot of information that came in, and we assessed them, and we found that it's doable, at least for the Philippines. So in other national regulatory authorities, there are 3 items that has to be there. The legal basis. Any adoption will have to be pegged on that legal basis. Otherwise, there is no adoption that will happen. Second, that the infrastructure is already ready. That the National Regulatory Authority has these infrastructure inside that would really facilitate. And number 3 is for international organizations to try to connect with them and then explain its usefulness, among other things. Sooner than later, these national regulatory authorities will be convinced. However, from the start, they would rely on their own evaluators. But if there is enough information that the other sources are also as reliable, then probably the rest of the 3 items will fall in line in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jesua. That's super. No, that's really, really good. A nice perspective. Let's just do one more panel question, and then we'll see what we've got on the chat. We've got limited time, but let's go to risk-based now, because risk-based I think is a very interesting one. What do regulators, industry, and regulatory systems need to do to adapt or dramatically change to embrace risk-based approaches in Asia? What do you think needs to happen to improve patient access? Jesse, I don't know if you can take that question first, or do you feel comfortable with that? Because that one is, it'd be interesting to know from your perspective in the Philippines, how you're adapting to risk-based approaches.
Okay, for us, we have been for quite a while now adopting risk-based both for inspection and for marketing authorization. So we are really looking at the speed of having the product made available in the market. With Reliance already in tow, even the high risk, we can reduce the length of evaluation, reduce it to just more than, well, it depends on the things that we need to look at, but risk-based inspection, we have begun having, we started it even before the pandemic, and then its use has been heightened during the pandemic, especially the need for COVID vaccine. These are high-risk products, but because of availability of Reliance, we had it available sooner because these are needed by the people. So depending on the criteria of each AMS on how do they define risk-based, because then again, it will have to rely on what is the existing legal framework. There are available definitions. You can look through the websites of other regulatory authorities, but then again, it will boil down to what are they going to adapt. In the Philippines, we had we had to study it. We had to review, and then we crafted our own regulations based on risk-based approach. Same thing with other regulatory authorities. There are stringent regulatory authorities, reference drug regulatory authorities that have a very good definition of risk-based. But these are just references. The National Regulatory Authority of the land will have to adapt it, and then from there, implement it. Just like the Philippines, you had to issue a lot of things to have these implemented into the local framework. Over.
Thank you, Jesse. That's super. Just move very quickly then to Diane and then to Marie, and then we'll have a look at some of the questions. So Diane first, risk-based approaches, what needs to happen?
I think wider adoption, as Israel said, we have evidence now, the very thin silver lining of the COVID cloud is that we were putting those theoretical approaches into practice and have demonstrated globally the ability to apply those safely. All companies want to put acceptable quality product that's adequate safety and efficacy. So they will have made those assessments internally and will be bringing to agencies risk assessments that they feel are appropriate for that patient. But I'd like to think that we can adopt that thinking wider as well. When you look at our oncology type products and other medicines that are being put on the market by many companies, that we're looking to make sure that we're saving the lives of people's mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, etc., that we're looking to take that right benefit versus risk approach and applying those in our product quality systems for inspection and assessment.
Thank you, Diane. And finally, Marie, risk-based approaches.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think risk-based approach is one of the main building block of any regulatory system. So when we look and when we do regulatory capacity with regulatory authorities, we always say you have to look where can you rely on another authority? What do you need to do together? And what do you need to do on your own in terms of nobody else is doing it? So it's very important to look at what is the risk and what can be done. Regarding the post-authorization changes, I think it's again, it's very good that we have a more pragmatic approach and looking at managing through PQS. The implementation of Q12 will take some time, and we know that it will take some time in some of the region and countries, and it's always the case with innovation or science. It's always quicker than maybe the legal framework, so it's always a catch-up exercise to try to accommodate. So I think it will take some time, but I think it's what is the way forward in terms of using resources as best as possible and being efficient. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. Jerry, do you see any good questions from the audience? There are plenty of good questions. I see quite a number. Have you got one that you think would be good?
Yeah. Actually, there are quite a number of questions, all very interesting. Maybe one that I can pick is the following one. Trust and communication is a key to enable success of regulatory reliance between all stakeholders. Why is it difficult and takes such a long time? What ways can all take to bring reliance success?
Yeah, great question. Marie, have a go at that one. Now, that's something I know you're passionate about, the trust and transparency. You've mentioned that. So yes. What can we do more?
Sure. No, I think it's not easy, but what we always say is it can be built in phases. So in terms of, because to be able to trust, you have to make sure that you understand the process of each other. So it can be about sharing assessment report and then moving to work sharing. So as we said, it's learning by doing and starting by small steps in terms of building trust. It takes some time because I think sometimes we are trying to even we are shifting the paradigm. It's amazing to see that, for CMC changes and post-authorization changes, some of the main stringent regulatory authorities are going to work together. And this is what we want to see. But obviously it needs some time to change the way they've been working, because if they are used to look at their own quality changes alone, I think it needs a bit of time, but we are getting there. And I think, as I said, COVID-19 was a strong accelerator. So hopefully we can take all the good lessons forwards. Thank you.
So thank you, Marie. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. I would love to continue this. I think it's fascinating, and we could have explored other areas as well. But we'll end here now. But I do thank all the panelists, Marie, Diane, Jesua, for super insights into this, and indeed for the entire session and all the speakers. So I'm just going to give a few very quick concluding remarks before we close out. Now, I wanted just to come back to these three pillars: convergence, harmonization, risk-based approaches, reliance. This is the way we structured this session together. And in the convergence and harmonization, we heard about harmonization, reducing unnecessary barriers, and super examples from the Philippines. We heard about the ICMRA pilot, and also around the industry experience from AZ on the key role of COVID-19 vaccines, and also the use of protocols. We shifted to reliance, and we heard about from WHO their perspective of the regulatory system strengthening a reliance, and the need for sameness and transparency as key areas. And indeed, we will address sameness tomorrow in the quality session, which would be interesting, I think, and important. There's been a number of questions that have come up today on that. The Sanofi showed a super example of a pack reliance. Just do it, basically, and have a go. And clearly some challenges, but definitely progressing well. And finally, risk-based approaches. We learned about how PQS can drive risk-based change management, and the industry through Parag showed how risk-based approaches can be used. So if we go to the next, and I think almost final slide. So I think what the message here really is, we just must continue the collaborations, build that trust, build that communication, adoption of the risk-based approaches. We basically need to do it. It does work. We can see it works. It's not so easy at times, but it works. And we've got to continue with the reliance and the risk-based approaches. Great opportunity right now. Let's go to the next slide. And I just wanted to highlight this just to people. If you want to know more, there's lots of things out there. We've heard about a number of presentations and other things. This also is one that you might find of interest, a joint position from FPA, IFPMA and Vaccines Europe on the path forward to optimize post-approval change management. And then if the final slide, I think, almost there now. Just suffice me to say thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the speakers, some super presentations. Thank you to Thierry, to Ali as well for